Good. What a wonderful group. 5 people. So wonderful. It's a nice small audience. This is so weird. It's like university, right? Like a lecture, university lecture. It's like really weird. Hi, everyone. My name is Marvin. And so I was asked to talk about startup accelerators, mainly accelerators coming from corporates as well as corporate venture capital, at least some of the things that I see. I want this to be interactive, so the presentation will probably be about 25 minutes or 30 minutes, and then I'll save the rest of the time for Q&A, and I'm happy to answer anything that you want to talk about or answer any questions that you actually have, all right? All right, so let's get started. Who I am, I was told I look very, very young, so just to let you know, I'm 43. I've actually been in the tech industry for a long time. So a little bit about myself. I've been in the startup industry, so I was at an e-commerce startup that raised about $30 million. I spent 10.5 years at Yahoo running many, many different business groups. And so when I joined Yahoo in 2001, the company was about 3,000 people. When I left Yahoo, it was about 15,000 people. So I was very, very fortunate to see a company grow very, very quickly. Most recently, I am a partner at 500 Startups, and so I'll talk about 500 Startups very, very quickly. By the way, for the translators, is this too quick? Is this okay? It's okay?
I think it's okay.
Someone's wearing
Yeah.
I hope everybody.
You're doing an amazing job.
We don't want any freelance stuff.
And I also mentor at many startup accelerators as well too. So government ones, I mentor at Nielsen's accelerator, T-Mobile's accelerator. So I've worked with private as well as large corporate accelerators too. Yeah, that's actually true. Nobody has and so 500 startups. Who's heard of 500 startups? Does anyone know 500 startups? Maybe 3 people, 4 people, 5 people. So 500 startups, we are a global seed fund and accelerator program. And so I actually run the accelerator program in San Francisco. So I've actually run now 9 programs. I've had about 337 companies actually go through my program for the last 4 years. Other things about the program, so we do 3 programs a year, and for every program we have somewhere between 30 to 40 companies, and we usually get about 3,000 applications for every program. So we take 30 to 40 companies out of over 3,000 applications. And so we're fairly selective, and so I think we're ranked the number 2 accelerator program worldwide. Right? And in this, we meet with lots of accelerators. We meet with many, many corporates. I've probably met with the CEOs and CFOs and CTOs and COOs of probably the top Fortune 150 companies, because they all visit us in San Francisco. They also visit us when they visit Silicon Valley. And so we meet and we advise a lot of companies as well too. A lot of big companies in regards to how to think about these programs. And so many things I share with you here are going to be some of the things that we talk with many of these corporates who come to visit us. Okay. And so there's this really why is this subject important? Why is innovation important? William Gibson, he's a very famous author. He had this great quote: "The future is already here. It's just not evenly distributed." And this is something that I see, Silicon Valley is a unique place to be, because a lot of the innovations that we see that happen in Silicon Valley, it takes about 2 to 4 years before many of it actually ends up sort of penetrating globally into other countries. And so what I find, even between San Francisco and New York, which are in the same country, there's probably about a 6 to 1 year difference of when a lot of these technologies are actually showing up in New York based on the startups and things that we're seeing. In Europe, I'm typically seeing this is typically about 6 months to a year of a lot of these innovations that come up. They show up in New York, then they show up in Europe, and so there's this lag time in general of a lot of these technologies. So blockchain is this big popular word here. I think it became very popular like last year because the FIS pushed it very, very hard. We've been talking about blockchain since like 2010. So it just gives you sort of like there's a little bit of lag time in regards to when many of these developments actually show up. But the good thing about this is that these are some books that I read a lot, some books that have been very, very helpful for me. The good news is that a lot of this information is out there. You just have to be able to go and find it. And I definitely recommend these books if you've not picked them up before. They're awesome, very easy to read. And I'm pretty sure Industries of the Future is actually in Japanese. And same thing with Flash Foresight. Daniel Burris is a very well-known forecaster on like global trends. I actually met him probably about 4 years ago, and he was incredibly helpful in regards to helping me think about like trend watching. Because what he does is that he looks at hard things like demographics. He looks at like different sort of like technology adoption, and a lot of that stuff is forecastable. And I think one of the things, if you based on everything that I'm talking about, is just that you're seeing change happen faster and faster. And I have this theory of why startups are starting to thrive faster and better is because startups are able to be on the edge of a lot of the innovation, and startups can also change very, very quickly. And this is actually one of the challenges of being at a large corporation, is that if you're a large corporation, your job is actually focusing on process innovation and little small things to basically defend your core businesses, not necessarily going after sort of like very big disruptive innovation. And so if you take a look at these projections of sort of like typical annual, this is for the S&P 500, the average corporate lifespan, and this is since like, this is over the last like 40, 50 years, like let's say even 2000, average corporate lifespan is like probably 24, 25 years, right? And now, like it's probably on average like less than, looking at these numbers, it's probably between like 15 to 20 years. So you're seeing the average decline of actually companies. It's harder and harder for companies to sort of thrive and survive and have those sort of like long lifespans because it's becoming harder to sort of adapt to these changes. And so, Mark Zuckerberg, I love these quotes, it's the biggest risk is not taking any risk. But the problem with sort of how most corporates are actually set up is they're set up not to take risks, right? You're set up to defend your core market, to defend your core revenue streams. And so, 500 Startups, we do a lot of work with corporates, and so we did this corporate innovation program. This is a survey for probably many of the top corporates, and if you're interested, this is actually a free report that you can actually download. But we actually interviewed like many successful and unsuccessful corporations as a survey to sort of find out, like what are the really innovative corporations doing. And you can read this, I'll share the deck with you, but there's a couple of things that they talk about. Is what's super important is making sure that they actually get buy-in from a lot of from many key people in the corporation. The other thing that they do is they take sort of more of a portfolio approach. And so they do a lot of what they call like proof of concepts. And they have a lot of different initiatives. Like if you look at the most innovative corporations, they do everything. They do a lot of like hackathons. They do a lot of like, they have an accelerator. They invest in VC funds. They have their own VC fund. They do lots of like corporate innovation, sort of like proof of concept projects. So they keep a very, very big portfolio. And a lot of times they're also very clear of having a lot of clear objectives of what they're trying to do with this innovation, not just a check mark. And the other thing that they try to do is they have very specific groups working with the startups, almost like an intermediary that is a translator for like the big company as well as for the startup to make sure that these companies actually connect well. And the most important thing, I think the big companies and what big companies do well working with startups is that they look at it as not like sort of like a power position. They look at it as a two-way street of like they're getting innovation insights and they're being very, very clear about like not wasting the startup's time. And so making sure that they're trying to add value to the startup as well too. And sometimes adding value to the startup is saying no, where it's like we're just not ready to sort of work with you. Because the worst thing you can do is actually waste the startup's time. Most corporations are actually not set up very well to work with startups. And so to be honest, with many of my companies, I tell them not to work with them. Most of the big companies, I tell them not to work with them because it's just too much, it's just too hard. Right? And so, the typical options that you have as a company, as a big corporate is building, to build, to buy, or to partner. And these are the options to do with anything, right? But this is actually just a good framework to think about how you should work with sort of particularly when it comes to corporate innovation, but also the general of how you think about startup accelerators and how you think about venture capital. Do you set it up yourself or do you partner? And a lot of the things you also want to think about is different considerations of in what stage do you actually want to interact with startup. Because if you're for me, most of the companies we deal with that I invest in are seed stage, pre-seed and seed, which is very, very early, right? There's some idea, there's a little bit of a working product, versus say if you're working with Series B or Series C, these companies tend to be fairly well established already, have raised between $50 to $100 million, very different. And so being very clear of knowing when and which stage you want to work with these startups in. My general recommendation for large corporates is typically Series B onwards. And like I said, if you want to work with early stage startups, there's different ways of doing it. And so, for example, if you want to work with seed stage and pre-seed, which is really the cutting edge, and I would argue the riskiest stage of actually interacting with startups, because the death rate is very, very high, right? So, for example, in our portfolio, we invest in, for every 100 companies we invest in, probably about 60 of the companies go to zero. We get nothing back. And then probably about another 20% of the companies that we invest in out of every 100 that we invest in. And we've invested in over 1,700 companies worldwide. Out of every 100, 60 go to zero. 20, we get $1 back, which is not very good. And so we only make money from 5 out of the 100 companies. This is how risky the pre-seed and seed stage is. And so that risk factor changes a lot as you go into, as you're going from later stage, right? From venture capital typically, as they raise more money, the risk, and the likelihood of them dissolving or dying goes down. And so just understanding sort of when to interact is important. And so if you're interested in the seed stage interaction, I think the accelerator mechanism is the best way to interact with early stage startups in the pre-seed or seed stage. And why? Why does this make sense? Why would corporations do this? Number one, you get a lot of insights into what's happening in super early stage because many of the companies I've invested in, you won't hear about for 5 years because they're so early, right? And it takes time as they develop and figure out product to market fit. And so a lot of times is you will learn a lot of incoming trends before they become big trends. That's typically one benefit of getting insights from the market. The other part, boosting sales and marketing, is definitely helpful, right? Being able to interact with early stage startups. And on top of that, you get, this is another way to sort of attract more collaboration and partnerships with a lot of these companies. And last of all is actually bringing in a culture of entrepreneurship, right? Of just educating many of the corporate people, of teaching them how to become much more entrepreneurial. Because by being surrounded by other sort of startup founders and early stage startups, it is helpful. You do learn new things of mindset change for corporations. So these are the reasons to do sort of startup accelerators. And so these are all the considerations that you need to have in regards to, and this is why running, so yes, I think running a corporate startup and accelerator is a good idea. It's really hard. Because it typically will take you 3 to 4 programs before you know what you're doing and to optimize all these things to understand how this is actually going to work. So I've run 9 programs and I'm still learning how to run a good program, right? And I think my program is considered one of the top 3 programs globally. And so things to think about is what stage do you want to invest in? Do you want to invest in idea stage? Do you want to invest in pre-seed, seed where there's some working product? Or is this going to be more later stage where they've already raised $10 million and then you're bringing into a program to sort of integrate them better into your company? Typically size, how many companies? Do you want 3 companies, 20 companies, 50 companies in your program? These are considerations. What does a selection process look like? Is it going to be application? Are you going to actively go and like look for companies, hunt for companies? And there's no right answer here. Resourcing. Are you going to build this yourself, or are you going to like hire people to go and like build it yourself, like startup people to go and help you manage and build a program, or are you going to partner with somebody? What does a program actually look like? Are you going to have a lot of talks? Is it going to be workshops? What does it actually look like, right? So for example, at 500 Startups, for us, every week, we typically have like 4 or 5 talks a week. That's it. Like we don't have, versus if you're at Techstars, you have a talk, like 2 talks like every day. It's almost like more like school. And so you have to think about like what's the value you're providing for these companies, right? The intersection, like how active is this going to be with a corporation? Is it going to, is there's going to be direct interaction with like a lot of the corporate business unit heads, or is this going to be a completely separate sort of like area and business unit? And on top of it, is this going to be, are you investing for equity? Like, do you give them money for equity, or is this just going to be sort of more of an interaction, sort of like a free program? Or is this going to be some like proof of concept at the end of like the program? Like, what does it look like? These are just some things to sort of like think about of how you in regards to your program. And ultimately, like, why should a the most important part, like, all these things lead to this, which is really what's the value proposition for the startup, right? Like, why should a startup go to your program when there's probably close to 2,000 startup program, accelerator programs like in the world, right? Like there's a lot of programs out there, and most of them are not very good. So why should anybody go to your program? And this is something to think about. All right. Any questions so far? All right. Yes.
Can you give some examples of value proposition for staff?
Yeah. So for example, right? I'll use one. Yeah. So the question is, what's the value proposition for like a startup of just like, so for example, we have a GM, like we're working with GM. So we have a program that we're doing with GM as part of the main accelerator. The value proposition of why you would join the GM track is because at the end of it, you get mentors from GM who, experts in like AI, in VR, who can actually work with you, or manufacturing. And the other benefit is that at the end of the program, if GM, we find that there's a good fit, GM will actually give them like a proof of concept, like a paid proof of concept. So $100,000 to $500,000 proof of concept with an early stage startup. So that's a value proposition of like why go through all the trouble. So does that make sense? Or in some cases, like Barclays, it's a proof of concept, right? You get an investment and a proof of concept with Barclays. Or other ones where it's like you get access to like distribution. So for example, if you're a telco, like a telecom accelerator, one of my friends runs the accelerator for True Incube. True Incube is like they're one of the biggest telcos in Thailand. And the benefit is you come to our accelerator program and your mobile app, like we will give you distribution across like our like 20 million customers at True, which is like the big telco. So it kind of depends on like what the value is there.
So do you have any typical pattern for value proposition by industry or by stage, or completely different for company to company?
It could be different from company to company. Yeah. And so this is something you want to think about is ultimately like what do you bring to the table? So for example, like Comcast, right? Like Comcast, like if you're a startup, Comcast has a lot of customers. And so that's like, for example, showing whatever your app, showing your media project, showing that in front of like, giving access to a lot of customers. That's the distribution is actually one of the reasons like Comcast's program is actually very popular for startups.
Thanks.
And so this is an example. This is an old one, they're not around anymore, but this is a great example of like building an in-house startup accelerator. And why I think that they did a good job, at least before the new management came and shut it down, long story, but I actually think they did a great job because the interaction that startups actually had with like Turner, like Turner, the big media company, they're part of, I think they're part of AT&T now, but anyways, so there's a big media company in the US. Why they did a great job is that every startup that actually came into the program, it's usually 8 to 10 startups in their program. And what was really good is that every executive, like so every business unit head at Turner, part of their goals was to basically mentor like the startup founder and to teach them how to interact with with larger corporations. That was actually their goal. And so they were responsible, every single business unit head at Turner was actually responsible for a startup and actually making sure that they were successful and able to get sort of like integration into some aspect of Turner's business. And so that was really interesting. And so they did a great job. I'm a big fan of actually sort of like what Turner Media can. And the unfortunate part was that a new management team came in. It was working very, very well, but a new management team came in and just basically shut down the program because that's what happens, right? But it was actually considered a good program. Other examples of these programs, right? Of like partnering. And so everyone knows Techstars. So what Techstars, one of their big initiatives that they do is that they work with like large companies. So for example, like Techstars is working with Ford for their mobility product. So they basically bring in somebody to set up a program for Ford and partner with Ford and almost act like a translator, and so almost like kind of be the intermediate between the big company of Ford as well as like the startup world, and do the recruitment and manage the program. It's very expensive though. I think each program is like $1.5 to like $3 million for like 2 programs a year, so it's not cheap. And they also do this with Barclays in South Africa and London and New York. And so they do 2 programs a year, and it's 8 to 10 companies. And so this is an example of partnering. And 500, we've done a program with like Deloitte in Europe, where what we do is that we bring a lot of we work with a bunch of banks to understand sort of like what their problems are. And so us and Deloitte work with, to basically go find like startups that could be good sort of like proof of concepts that will be executed in the bank. And so that's another example of just like we're sort of like a partnership instead of like some of these banks in Europe doing it themselves. Our program actually works to go and find the right startups to integrate with and to run and execute a portfolio of proof of concepts. Does it make sense? Okay, and these are some examples of this is interesting. Both RGA and Disney Accelerator, they actually started off working with Techstars, and so they worked with Techstars for 1 or 2 years, learned how to build a program, and then they basically ended the Techstars program and actually built their own program. Actually, both very successful. And so both of them are now running very successful programs. So they were, I think RGA and Disney were probably the first 2 large corporates to work with Techstars in the early days. And now they've learned enough after running, I think they did 2 or 4 programs, and now they're running their own programs now, based on the things that they've learned. And so let's talk about, sort of venture capital, corporate venture capital. These are also 2 books I recommend if you're interested in sort of this space. I found them to be very, very helpful. This book just came out by Jim Stengel. He was the CMO actually at Procter & Gamble. So, one of the things that you're going to see, I actually think there's going to be time that every corporation, every Fortune 500 corporation, I firmly believe, is going to have some type of venture capital. They have to. Whether it's investing in some venture capital fund, setting up their own venture capital fund, I think there's going to be a period of time everybody is going to have a venture capital fund. Because in the beginning, you look at no surprise, most of the early stage venture capital, most of the venture capital that occurred were IT driven, right? Mainly because they're in Silicon Valley, which makes sense. Also one of the fastest moving industries. But over time, you're seeing a lot more of these other sectors, right? So Bloomberg, media, Westfield, almost everybody has some type of program now. These are some fairly well-known companies, some Japanese, but in every single industry. And I think eventually we are going to move to the point where every corporate is going to have a program. I firmly believe that. And on top of that, you're seeing massive activity happening. There's a huge growth of corporate venture capital over the last, particularly the last big explosion over the last couple of years. This is on quarterly. So if you look at this is actually by quarter, right? So these are the deals and the amount of money. Hey, Yohei, what's up, man? And this should also be like no surprise that I actually think like the most active corporate venture capital, at least corporates who have venture capital funds, Intel, Google, Salesforce, Comcast, these are some of the most like innovative companies, and I think like there's a direct correlation that the more active they are in corporate venture capital, I think the more innovative they are, right? Because you see a lot more stuff and you have a lot more data points, and I think that's actually there's a lesson here, right? I think corporate venture capital is actually really important, and so these are some examples of who I think are sort of like corporates that are doing a very, very good job when it comes to setting up their own venture capital and of building, right? Like Intel Capital's probably been around very, very long time. Google Ventures, as well as YJ Capital. I think the big difference of why they're successful is they're not just strategic, these are financial driven. So all the partners like Intel, GV, YJ, like they are measured by not just the strategic value that they bring in, they're measured by the financial returns. That's the best way you have to think about it. The main reason corporate venture capital doesn't work is if it's not financially driven, in my opinion. Right, because ultimately that means you're adding value, right? And that's traditionally why I think Intel's done the best here. And YJ, Yahoo Japan, I think like they're considered one of the better VC funds because I also think it's because they are financially driven. They're not purely, sort of strategic driven. These are other examples. Why I think that these venture capital funds are doing well. So this is Microsoft Ventures and Salesforce. Is they actually do a good job of leveraging like the resources of actually like their main corporate parent. And so for example, Salesforce, as you know, they have one of the best biggest CRM systems, and they also are building sort of an app ecosystem. Almost all their investments are actually companies that they can actually bring in and actually bring into the Salesforce ecosystem and actually application world. So that's why I think like they're very effective because they add a lot of value to the portfolio, like the companies that they invest in. And the same thing with Microsoft, where Microsoft can actually provide a lot of like cloud services to their company. And also a lot of the times Microsoft Ventures brings a lot of like these products that they've invested in, and actually Microsoft, like some of the business units actually become customers for for some of these. So they actually add value to the portfolio, to the companies they've invested in. This is an example. Has anyone heard of Touchdown Ventures? So Touchdown Ventures, what they do is that they're like an outsourced VC. So these are professional venture capital. I think they have like 5 partners. And what they do is that they invest actually on behalf of some of corporates. So I think Westfield, there's like 5 or 6 very big corporates in the US. They didn't tell me all their names, but apparently there's 5 very, very big corporates. What they've done is that Touchdown almost acts like a scout for investments for them and actually invests on their behalf. So they bring a lot of deals to the main sort of like corporate, sort of like corporate body. So this way, like a lot of these corporates, like Westfield, doesn't have to set up their own VC fund. They have money, and so they bring deals to Westfield, which is a big mall, big US and Australian sort of mall operator. And so they bring deals where Westfield tells them, this is our thesis, these are the areas that we're very much interested in, like go find us deals in these areas at this stage. And so this is what Touchdown is, like an outsourced VC arm for many of these big corporates. And of course the other thing that you can do as a corporate is invest in VC funds and learn about the deal flow. And yes, so anyways, last of all, this is why we talk about this, why this is important. This is a quote, which is the only way you survive is to continually transform into something else. It's this idea of continuous transformation that makes you an innovation company. And this is the present CEO of IBM. So, any questions? This is my presentation. Yes?
Thank you very much for the presentation. That stimulates me a lot. Thank you very much. And the question regarding CVC, that I believe that the majority of Japanese corporation joining to the world of Silicon Valley in order to get strategic return rather than financial return by creating the CVC. But what I'm wondering is that why, let's say in case of Toyota, that the majority of startups would like to make a relationship with Toyota Corporation without making a connection with CVC. Why Toyota create CVC? Is it necessary to do that? Because naturally that I feel that the majority of the startup gonna be very happy to make a discussion with Toyota directly.
That's a good question, right? So here's my opinion. I actually think that the challenge of sort of like Toyota itself, or any big company in general, right? Where you look at the Fortune 100, you're like, well, any startup would want to partner or do something or become have them become a customer. The challenge is just most of the time, like even a large company like Toyota is actually not set up to sort of like integrate and to see some of these newer things that are coming in. And corporate venture capital is actually good, in my opinion, a very good mechanism to sort of see sort of what's happening. Because if you think about like innovation in general, innovation tends to happen sort of more toward the edges. It's not usually mainstream. And venture capital is very well suited to be looking at sort of the edge of like a lot of like technological sort of like innovations. And a lot of larger companies are just not, I think mindset wise, it's not that they're not smart, but a lot of times if you look at many of the senior officers, when you're thinking about things on a quarter or annual basis, you don't look at things that are going to affect your business like 5 years out or 10 years out. And I think VC is very good for that versus sort of like the operating sort of like business unit. Does that make sense?
Oh, thank you very much. I clearly
Yeah.
understand on that.
Yeah.
And in addition to that, actually my company is wondering whether we should create CVC or not. And is it compulsory for the company to decide which kind of field we should investigate before making a CVC or not?
I think about this very much like a startup. I think a lot of it really, I think you need both, right? I think you need to have a very clear thesis on sector and thesis that you're investing in. And I think you also need to have people who are like much more sort of like in the startup world, who are not coming from corporates. So I'll give you an example, like I'm a VC now. It took me 2 years to like unlearn all my corporate sort of like habits. It did, like I was very fortunate when I left Yahoo in beginning of 2012. I didn't work for 2 years. I just goofed around and angel invested in things. It took me 2 years to unlearn everything. And I think that's one of the challenges. This is my opinion. From what I see, I think what typically happens and why I think Japanese corporates don't do a good job here is because they don't hire experts or they don't train people. What they do is they go find somebody where it's like, here's a salary man who's been at, I don't know, whatever this big corporation is for like 10, 15 years, and now you're running the CVC, right? And there's a learning curve. There's a very long learning curve in learning what VC is, learning what are good investments, like, and so if you're not in this world, like it's really challenging. And then what happens is, then the corporate's gonna look at this and go, wait a minute, like I have not seen any results for a year, like I'm gonna shut it down, and then all that learning's gone, right? So I think you have to invest in this for a long period of time. And I think that's one of the challenges of being a corporate VC is that you have to commit for a while. But I think the problem with a lot of the Japanese corporates is that they don't get the right people and they're not compensating, right? So, for example, like even Jafco, right, which I think is a private VC, like the partners there, they don't get carried. So if I invest really well, I should get some amount of money, right? Carry, people know what carry is, right? But carry is the 20% of like profits. And so like if you do good investments and I don't get any benefit from that, so from my salary, I'm probably going to leave soon. Right? So I think structurally, a lot of the corporate VCs are not set up very well.
All right, thank you very much.
If you have any questions, I have a lot of strong opinions about this, but I see a lot of companies like Japanese, Chinese corporates, Taiwanese corporates, Korean corporates, American corporates. Like we talk with everybody because they're downstream capital and they visit us all the time. So I meet a lot of these accelerator programs. I meet a lot of these like corporate VCs, and most of them are not doing a good job. I have a lot of friends who work at corporate VCs. Most of them are not very good. So yes.
Thank you for your presentation. You mentioned there is a lot of CDC or no, accelerator program by corporation. But
Most of them are crap.
so I will ask you the typical bad things for typical bad point.
Yeah, so number one, like one of the biggest challenges is that it's not very clear sort of like the value proposition. Why would a startup? So the problem, what we see is that most of the corporate accelerator programs, like if it's a competition to get the best startups, we will always win. Right? Because there's lots of accelerators in general. And so most of the time the corporate where it's like there's a negative signaling of going to a corporate accelerator if it's not a very well-known one. So that's one problem. So it's not clear what value the corporate is actually going to provide. That's one big issue. And a big part about that is because most of the time the corporate accelerators are usually not run by startup people. They're usually run by salarymen. Right? And so if you're a salaryman, you're like, what do you know about startups? You know nothing about startups. And so how can you actually help them? That's really important, right? Because like how you think about fundraising in early stage is very different. How you think about getting to product to market fit, sales, marketing, like all these things. Like if you haven't done it before, how can you be helpful? Not to say you can't be helpful, but it's like you just don't understand. Like you actually don't understand the problem that they actually have. So why would you be, and this is actually the same for like most accelerator programs. Most accelerator programs are not run by like people who have any experience in sort of like the startup world, and that's a problem.
So the best way to solve that problem is, as you mentioned, it's like partnership and build. So like Disney accelerator, learn from our accelerators, and takes like textures, and then set their own.
Yeah, or the other thing that typically happens is, for example, like True Incube. I think they have a great program. They're in Thailand. I mentor there. They have a great program because they've hired everyone who runs the program are all startup founders. So they've hired them into the corporation and given them a lot of resources and given them a lot of like, have defended them from the rest of the corporation and given them a very clear mandate. And they report in directly to the CEO of the company. So they have a lot of power. And so it works really well. So they're integrated. Yes?
I have two questions. The first one is, seems like there's a competition among CVCs.
Yeah, absolutely.
But when sourcing, how do they differentiate themselves?
Yeah, so, I would say for most CVCs, they're the funder of last resort. You go to, like outside of like Google Ventures, which is pretty well known, or Intel Capital, like the reality is that you will try to get money from like the financial driven like venture capital funds, and if you can't, then you'll get it from like the CVCs. That's just the way it is. And I think it's very, very clear where in later stage, CVCs can add a lot of value, but usually not leading the round, usually sort of like where there's already some lead already in the round, and they come in and sort of like fill up the rest of the round where they're sort of like more on they're more of a follower. That's usually works pretty good. But when CVCs are leading rounds, it's not usually a good signal. Does that make sense?
Yeah. My second question is that I think the human resource, the finding good talent is key for success. But where and how do you find good professionals in those venture capital field?
Yeah, there aren't a lot of them. I mean, it's a very small group, right? And to be very honest, it takes probably, even me, I've been doing this for almost 4 years now. Like, I think I'm good at it. I'm not sure because it's still like I'm starting to see some of my companies do well, but it's like the feedback loop just takes a long time, and so it's really hard to find them. And so some level of training, and also I think about it, venture capital is still very much an apprenticeship business of like you work with like established investors who teach you how to think about this stuff. Then you get better at this, and also by doing deals. But it's really hard. And so the reality is that the best way by hiring, like pay well and you hire like good people. That's really the only way. Like any sort of thing that you want to do, right? You have to be willing to pay for good talent. And that's also one problem is that a lot of funds are not willing, many corporate VCs are not willing to pay for the best people. So if you're not willing to pay for the best people, then you're not going to get the best people. It's simple, but it's just like most people don't practice it.
Since this event is titled FinTech Summit, I'd like to ask you a question. When you invest in companies, do you see the FinTech sector different from other sectors? Because the financial industry is, well, if not all, but heavily regulated in many countries. So I have a sense that the upside potential is somehow limited, or there could be some obstacles in compared to other industries. Or do you see soft ceiling or whatever?
So my batches, I've run 4 programs with very specific fintech track, and so I do look at fintech companies very differently. So I've invested, every batch I invest in 10 to 12 fintech companies. So I've probably had programs now, so probably about almost close to 50 companies that are fintech specific. Fintech is different because of regulatory aspect. So when I look at, let's just say most of the companies in my program already have some working product already and some level of traction, versus the fintech companies, because there's some regulations involved. I take them a little bit earlier. So for them, I look at sort of how well they've cleared some of the regulatory hurdles versus product traction. But on the other hand, like, it's a huge industry. So some of the companies I look at are companies that are trying to disrupt, like, sort of the big sort of sort of like the big banks and sort of financial institutes, and other companies that invest in the fintech space are actually selling directly to many of these financial institutes. And so I'm actually very bullish on like the fintech area. There's a lot of money. If you look at fintech as an industry or finance as an industry, it's actually probably one of the biggest industries on the planet, right? And so because of that, and because so many banks and many of these financial industries, whether they're insurance companies or whether they're sort of like the big banks, they're all badly managed, right? And I would say particularly in the US and in Europe, because of the economic crisis in 2008, customers hate them. Like, there's very little trust. And so there's a very interesting opportunity to sort of like disrupt a lot of these companies. And there's also a lot of interesting opportunities. Like, one of the companies I invested in, like, is actually selling to the big insurance companies to make them more efficient. And so there's opportunities to make them to sell to big companies. There's opportunities to also disrupt them. So I'm very bullish actually on the fintech space.
So really suppose that this industry will continue to expand. So which strategy would you focus on? So more unicorns or more exits? You said 5 out of hundreds startups.
Yeah, so we typically will only have like 1 out of 100 companies we invest in, 1 to 2 companies will be unicorns.
So you try to make more unicorn in the future. So more funds, more startups, or more exit. So successful exit, no unicorns.
I mean, I actually think like VC is about, this is what people don't understand about VC, right? Like, yes, I would love it if every one of my 100 companies I invested in were like unicorns. But this is what I'm finding is that it's just so hard because the death rate is really, really high in the portfolio. And so I still think it's always going to be 1 to 2 companies every 100 that become unicorns. And so every company I invest in needs to have the potential of becoming a unicorn. And so this is why VC is very challenging, is that there's very specific business models that are VC fundable. Less than 2%, I'd say less than 2 to 3% of companies out there that get started every year are VC fundable. Most businesses are not VC fundable. Does that make sense?
So, and from prospective investors, so suppose you were LP or you were an angel. So, what kind of VCs will accelerate you to invest in? So for instance, the VCs. focused on our stage and have this kind of programs, accelerated programs, or just has a good track record. The partner has a good track record. What's the criteria do you have in mind?
So I don't understand your question. Can you ask that question again?
Okay, so my question is, so from the perspective of investor, what will be the good VC fund?
What is a good VC fund?
Okay, so let me focus on the accelerator. So what is a good accelerator?
You mean like an example of a good accelerator?
No, your opinion. What makes the good accelerator? What is criteria?
Oh, what is a good criteria of a good accelerator? I think that number one, it needs to be fairly selective and have a good brand name, right? Like, because otherwise, like, that's how you attract the best deal flow. And I actually think like the programming is actually really important, right? Like just like what you're actually teaching the company. So for example, like in my program, I only focus on three things. I focus on customer acquisition, like sales and marketing. I focus on storytelling, because in early stage of just like what's the market you're going after, it's very important. Like a lot of times startups don't understand that. So how do you tell your story? And number three, fundraising. Like how do you think about fundraising? Who should be raising money from? How much you should be raising? That's all we do our program on, right? And versus say, for example, other programs, like there's some programs they focus just on product, and other programs focus just on fundraising. So it's just like understanding what are the areas you sort of like think that you can actually help the company. So we're very well known for sales and marketing. And the other part is just fundraising, the relationships you have with downstream capital. That's really important. So I need to make sure like all my companies have an opportunity to have the relationships with like later stage VCs. And so we do that for them. Yeah. Any other questions? Yes.
In your presentation, you mentioned some countries such as Thailand and South Africa, not your company's region. And do you think that it's a good idea for your company, your VC, to expand the region at this moment? Because in the US, the competitiveness for VCs are becoming so severe.
Yeah, you know, a lot of it really depends on the space and sector you're interested in, right? So for example, if you happen to be very interested in like cybersecurity, US is good, but the reality is probably Israel or Estonia would be very good places that I would spend time in, right? If you're consumer focused, you know, I know lots of Japanese VCs going to Jakarta, like, you know, going to Indonesia because it's a huge market, it's growing. So I think a lot of it really depends on your sector and whether you actually have an edge or not, right? You know, like for example, if you're interested in blockchain, like Zurich and Zug, like you should be spending time in like London, Silicon Valley, or you have to go to where the center is, right? If you are in retail, it's probably New York or London, where that's where a lot of those interesting startups are. If you're in video, it's probably Hollywood. So I think it really depends on sort of like your sector, and then going there, right, of where you think the best companies are and being integrated into that. That's my opinion. Yeah, the blockchain, like blockchains, Zug in Switzerland, there's some really interesting things happening there. And so, you know, anyone who's interested in that area, do go there. Any other questions?
Could you tell me more about the RG's corporate venture?
Okay.
I'm with Life Insurance Group, and I'm very curious what kind of the differentiator to make it successful. So, RGS, corporate venture.
So what makes corporate venture successful? Okay, so I think this is a challenge, I think, with corporate venture in general, like just like anything with corporates. I think like whether you're starting an accelerator, whether you're starting a corporate VC fund, you actually have to like stick with something for a long time, because like I'll give you an example. Like the problem with most corporates when they start VC, they do it for 3-4 years, and then they quit and they go, okay, we'll spin it out, we just shut it down. And it takes you 3 to 4, maybe even 5 years before you really know what you're doing. And so I actually think some ability where it's just like we're investing into this business for the next 5 to 10 years and making a long-term commitment, and also making sure you get the best people, and that the VC fund is actually structured the right way, where there are clear benefits to the people to sort of like make sure people want to stay. And so, like I said, making sure that they're financially oriented. So, as an example, like the people who run the fund, like they get carry from this, like basic things like that, right? But making sure they're compensated properly, and also being very, very clear about sort of like what the intersection, and being very, very clear of sort of like what success looks like. Like, is this corporate venture just purely from a strategic perspective that you're bringing new technologies back to the mothership and then making sure that you can implement them in the mothership? Or is it just for financial return? Is it a combination of both? And I think most corporate VCs don't even know what that is, and that's part of the reason they look at it and like corporate headquarters looks at us after 3 years and like, wait a minute, what are you doing? And the metrics just weren't there because they weren't clear what the metrics were to begin with and what the goals were.
Yeah. So life insurance has a very long, time horizon. So, but basically, so startups time horizon is very short.
Yeah.
The big difference is a big obstacle.
Yeah.
And so, and I'm very curious. So, how so are these venture capital so overcome or so such a gap? So like that.
Yeah. So I think what you have to figure out, what the larger corporation needs to figure out is, okay, like while you're doing VC, and assuming if you do VC, your goal is to bring new innovations, right? Like, what's the goal? Is it to bring in innovations that could disrupt your business, or are you bringing innovations to sort of like fine tune, like, to basically, bring in new technologies to run your business better, manage your business better, right? Those are two very different things, and having a very clear view of what that thesis is, that's my opinion, right? So I think you need to know why you're doing venture capital. Is it to sort of like potentially disrupt your own business, right? Or are you doing it just to like bring in technologies to optimize your business? Those are two different things. And you should have an answer for that before you set up, right?
Thanks so
Yeah.
much.
It may sound weird, but is there anything that you think that you could do something more for the startups that you had supported, but it failed and it shut down the businesses? Because I think you have been supporting so many startups, but not all of them were successful.
Yeah, most of them will not be successful.
Yeah, so that's why I'm wondering if there was something that you could do more. I'm not offending, but
Yeah, no. This is. I mean, here's the way I think about it, right? That this is why I had to sort of like unlearn. It took me 2 years to unlearn a lot of things from like running a business, being at a corporate. Just at the end of the day, sort of as an investor, we're just advisors to the company, right? So I've learned of just like my mistake of investing. This is a nuance to this, but my mistake of making investment was like, I love that business, and I think the founder is somewhat smart. But if I was running this business, like I could make this business very successful. Like that's actually the wrong thing to do, the wrong mindset to go into investing. My mindset is like I want to find the best founders working on the most interesting businesses ever, and my job is just to advise them, and at the end of the day, and give them advice, right? And they can listen, they can not listen, but because at the end of the day, they're the ones who are running the business, not me. And so I don't control their business. And so what I realized of just like I can't take responsibility. So I have lots of successful companies. I can't, I don't know if I take responsibility for that. Like I can help them. I think I'm helpful, but I can't get the credit for that, right? And it's the same thing of the companies that aren't successful. I also shouldn't get the blame for that either. My job is just to be helpful, answer questions, give advice, and it's up to them whether they take it or not. And this is something I think a lot of corporate VCs also need to understand, is that if you just as an investor, your job is to advise and to help them, but you don't own the company and you don't run the company. And this is actually why corporate VCs do not have a good reputation in general, because they go, I've invested in this company, you're like, I'm telling you what to do. It's like, you don't know anything, right? Like, why would you like? Well, you don't know anything about this. Like, you give bad advice. Like, it makes no sense, right? So, I think it's a mindset change that you have to be good as a VC. Does that answer your question?
And one more question.
Yeah.
And what was? I know that you are not responsible for the company. You are not owning the company, but among your support and advices, what was most appreciated by the
I tell them the truth. I tell them when they're stupid and doing something really stupid. I tell them to sort of like this is hard, right? Like firing people is really hard. So a lot of times if you have a co-founder and it's not working, and they're like, well, I want to think about it. And I'm just like, no, you need to do this now. Like it's up to you, your company. But like the sooner you get this done, like you need to do this now. But it's your call, right? And here's why you need to do this. My job is to basically push them. My job is if they're planning on doing, going after this customer, and I'm going like, this doesn't make any sense. Like they're not ready for you. You're not set up properly. You just sort of like support them. Like I always tell them the truth. They can still go do it, but at least I tell them like, this is what I think based on my experience and I think my expertise. You can do whatever you want, right? Like, but just like this is my guidance to you. And so that's the only thing we do. And I always tell them the truth, even when it hurts. When I think they're doing something really stupid, I tell them. And I'm not very nice about it. Where I'm just like, this is really stupid. You're wasting your own time while you're doing this. And they can still keep on doing what they're doing, but at least it helps them fine tune their decision making better. Any other questions? Yeah.
So you said the Techstars has 2 talks a day, and
yeah, it's like they have like a lot of programming. It's just like that's an example,
so
right?
if I remember correctly, so 500 has 4 to 5 talks a week or a day. Okay, so let me suppose that
4 to 5 talks a week.
Yeah, the number of talks is now currently appropriate frequency for each company. So what makes the appropriate number different? Just the number of captures or some factors such as hands-on or 500 is more hands-on or?
Yeah, so the difference is that, like I said, I think it's going to really depend on the stage of the companies that you're dealing with. A lot of it is also going to be really dependent on, like how mature the companies are. So many of our companies are already making money already, right? Like the typical company in our batch usually is making anywhere between $10,000 to $100,000 like a month already. So it's a little bit later stage. And I also think our philosophy is also a little bit different, where the Techstars philosophy is much more like school. Like you need to be here, like we tell you what to do, you have to do this. It's like mandatory, you need to do this. I tend to take a little bit more of like, you need to know what your philosophy is. And my philosophy is more, I'm going to treat you like an adult, I'm going to treat you like an entrepreneur, and you can attend the talks that you can attend all the talks, you can attend none of the talks, it's up to you. And so I leave it to them, right? On just like, you don't have to go to every single talk. If this talk is not useful or relevant for your business, you shouldn't go. On the other hand, if you are having fundraising problems and you don't attend any of the fundraising workshops, I'm gonna be like, what are you doing, right? Like you're stupid. Like what are you doing? So I think for me, I treat you like an adult, and so that's philosophically how I handle it. And you have to decide like how you want to do, how you want to run your program. Do you want to run it like school and run it like they're children, and you have to be here. You have to sort of like check your metrics every week. I'm just like, you should be checking your metrics anyways. Like my view is just like, I treat you like an adult. If you aren't doing that, that probably means you're not a good founder. So I will spend less time with you.
Okay, so Techstars is more structured.
Yeah, they're super structured.
Yeah,
they're. My view is just like, I don't think the Techstars program. I would not be happy running a Techstars program. It's like running a school. I'm not interested in that.
Thanks.
Any other questions? All right. Well, thank you very much for joining. And if you have any questions, you please feel free to come chat with me, or I'll give you my email. But thank you very much for your time.